Evelyn Carter, the icy chief executive of the private airline Carter Aero, mocked Mason Reed in front of the entire board, telling him flatly that he could not even fix a toy plane. Mason only glanced past her at the 12 jets waiting in the hangar and answered calmly, "Then your 12 jets are finished." Nobody believed a quiet single father wearing an old worker jacket could shake a billion-dollar aviation empire. He looked too tired, too ordinary, too poor to matter to anyone in that room. But by the next morning, one jet after another began to die. The hangar at Carter Aero stretched wide and silver under the morning light. 12 private jets lined in formation like soldiers waiting for orders, their fuselages polished to a mirror shine for the investors who would soon walk past them. Evelyn Carter moved through that hangar the way she moved through every room she owned, with her heels striking the concrete in sharp, deliberate beats, her tailored coat trailing behind her like a verdict already decided. She had inherited this empire from her father, and she had spent 5 years proving to every doubter that a woman could run it harder, colder, and faster than he ever had. Logan Pierce walked half a step behind her, his tablet glowing with maintenance reports, his smile the practiced kind that men wear when they want something from everyone in the room at once. When they reached the far end of the hangar, a man in a faded gray jacket was already crouched beside the landing gear of the 6th jet, his hands steady, his eyes scanning a panel of warning lights most people would never learn to read in a lifetime. Logan gestured toward him with the casual cruelty of someone introducing furniture. "This is Mason Reed," he said, "a contract mechanic, a single father who takes whatever work he can get these days." Evelyn barely looked up from her phone as she answered, her voice flat with disinterest, telling Logan to have him finish quickly so the real engineers could do the real inspection. Mason said nothing in response to either of them. He simply kept reading the diagnostic panel, his jaw tightening slightly as the numbers in front of him refused to make sense in any way that meant good news. When he finally stood, brushing the dust from his knees, he spoke directly to Evelyn for the first time, telling her that all 12 jets shared the exact same flaw buried inside their fuel control systems, and that flying any of them in their current state was a risk no insurance policy would ever cover. Evelyn turned to face him fully then, amused in the particular way powerful people are amused by inconvenient truths spoken by people they have already dismissed. She asked him, almost laughing, how a man who looked like he had walked in off the street could possibly understand systems that cost more than his entire life had ever earned. Mason held her gaze without flinching, without raising his voice, without giving her the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. The silence stretched long enough that even Logan shifted his weight, sensing something shift in the air that he could not yet name. Evelyn broke it first, her voice sharp enough to cut, telling him plainly that he could not even fix a toy plane, let alone touch a fleet worth more than most cities. The mechanics nearby went quiet, waiting to see how a man so easily humiliated would respond to a woman who held his paycheck in her hand. Mason glanced past her shoulder at the 12 jets gleaming under the hangar lights, each one representing contracts, reputations, and a fortune built across 2 generations. Then he looked back at Evelyn, his voice low, even, and entirely without anger, and said the words that would follow her for the rest of that year. "Then your 12 jets are finished," he told her, and turned to gather his tools without waiting for a reply. Logan let out a short, disbelieving laugh, certain the man had just ended his own career out of wounded pride. Evelyn said nothing further, watching him walk toward the hangar doors with the unhurried calm of someone who already knew something she did not. The other mechanics exchanged glances, none of them daring to speak, all of them sensing that something had just been set into motion that no apology could undo. Outside, the morning sky stretched clear and blue over the runway, utterly indifferent to the quiet war that had just begun inside that hangar. Mason Reed lived a life that asked nothing of anyone, in a small rented house at the edge of town where the porch light flickered and the truck in the driveway ran on patience more than parts. He had raised his daughter alone since she was small, though she rarely appeared in the story he told himself about his own life, kept safely apart from the world of contracts and hangars and men like Logan Pierce. He took whatever mechanical work came his way, fixing lawn equipment, old trucks, and once, memorably, a neighbor's ancient riding mower that everyone else had declared beyond saving. Nobody in town knew that the quiet, soft-spoken man fixing their machines had once worked inside classified hangars where a single miscalculation could cost lives measured in the dozens. He never mentioned it, never let it slip over coffee or small talk, because that life had ended the day he watched a superior officer bury a safety failure to protect a budget instead of a crew. Evelyn, for her part, had learned to read people the way she read balance sheets, in quick glances and snap judgments that rarely left room for revision. She saw Mason's worn jacket, his unremarkable truck, his quiet refusal to explain himself, and she filed him away as exactly what Logan had presented him to be, a desperate man taking scraps of work to survive. Logan, meanwhile, had quietly made sure that Mason's full work history never reached Evelyn's desk, scrubbing the parts of his file that might have raised uncomfortable questions about why a man with his background was mopping up small jobs instead of running entire fleets. It was easier, Logan reasoned, to keep the technical team small, loyal, and unquestioning, especially with so much already hidden beneath the surface of Carter Aero's gleaming reputation. Mason had taken the contract job without complaint, needing the income. But something about the maintenance records he glimpsed in passing had unsettled him from the very first afternoon. The irregularities were subtle at first, a part replaced slightly ahead of its scheduled cycle, a signature that did not quite match the engineer it claimed to belong to, a pattern only visible to someone who had spent years trained to notice exactly these kinds of inconsistencies. Mason said nothing about his suspicions to anyone in those early days, choosing instead to watch, to document quietly in his own notes, and to wait for a moment when speaking up might actually be heard rather than dismissed. He had learned the hard way years earlier that raising an alarm too early, without proof, only gave powerful people the chance to bury the truth before it could breathe. So when he finally spoke that morning in the hangar, it was not an impulsive warning born of irritation, but the calculated conclusion of weeks spent quietly piecing together a pattern that pointed toward deliberate sabotage rather than simple negligence. Evelyn's mockery had only confirmed what he already suspected, that the people running Carter Aero were far more interested in appearances than in the truth sitting quietly inside their own fuel systems. Carter Aero stood on the edge of the most important week in its recent history, with an international investment summit set to bring together wealthy partners, foreign delegations, and the kind of money that could either expand the company into new continents or quietly sink it for good. All 12 jets were scheduled to fly within 2 days, carrying executives, dignitaries, and strategic partners whose confidence in the company depended entirely on a flawless, uneventful journey through the sky. Evelyn felt the weight of that timeline pressing against every decision she made, aware that her father's legacy and her own reputation were balanced on a fleet of machines she had never personally inspected. A rival aviation group had been circling for months, ready to swoop in with a cheaper, faster offer the moment Carter Aero showed even the smallest sign of weakness or delay. Logan reminded her of this constantly, framing every hour of caution as an hour handed directly to the competition and urging her to push the maintenance schedule forward no matter what minor concerns the technical staff raised. Mason, working quietly in the records room that Logan had reluctantly allowed him into, found something that made his stomach tighten in a way it had not in years. The maintenance logs for the fuel control modules had been altered, dates shifted just enough to suggest routine servicing had occurred when in fact it had not, the kind of falsification that only someone with deep access to the system could pull off cleanly. He brought his findings to Evelyn directly, laying out the discrepancies in plain, unhurried language, warning her that flying any of the 12 jets in their current state risked an engine failure mid-flight, not a minor inconvenience on the ground. Evelyn listened with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable, before concluding aloud that this looked less like genuine concern and more like a contractor inflating problems to justify a larger invoice. Logan nodded along eagerly, seizing the moment to suggest that Mason be removed from the property before he could cause further delays to a schedule already stretched to its limit. Evelyn gave the order without much hesitation, telling security to escort Mason out of the hangar and to find someone less dramatic to finish the remaining inspections. Mason did not argue or raise his voice, gathering his tools calmly while the security guards waited a respectful distance away, allowing him the dignity of leaving on his own terms rather than being dragged out. Before he passed through the hangar doors for what he assumed would be the last time, he left a short handwritten note on the clipboard hanging beside the dispatch office, the kind of note no one would notice until it was already too late to matter. It read simply that the fleet should not be started under any circumstances until someone qualified reviewed the fuel control systems again, a final warning offered freely to people who had already decided his warnings were worthless. Evelyn glanced at the note hours later, dismissed it with a small shake of her head, and turned her attention back to the summit preparations, certain that whatever Mason Reed believed he knew could not possibly outweigh the judgment of the engineers she actually trusted. The hangar lights dimmed for the night exactly as scheduled, 12 jets sitting silent and unaware of what the morning would bring. Morning broke clear and bright over the Carter Aero runway, the kind of perfect flying weather that should have made everyone in the hangar relax instead of tighten with dread. The ground crew began the routine startup sequence on the first jet, expecting the familiar hum of engines settling into a smooth idle, but instead the controls flickered with a warning that refused to clear no matter how many times the sequence was restarted. Within 20 minutes, the second jet reported a fuel pressure fault that made no sense according to its most recent service record, a record that listed the relevant part as freshly inspected and fully operational. The third jet began to vibrate unnaturally during a routine engine test, a shudder strong enough that the technician at the controls cut the power immediately rather than risk further damage. Word spread through the hangar in tense, hushed phrases, each new failure landing like another stone dropped into a pond already rippling with panic. By mid-morning, all 12 jets had been pulled from active rotation, each one flagged for a different combination of warnings that somehow traced back to the exact same system Mason had pointed to 2 days earlier. Evelyn stood in the center of the hangar trying to project calm for the benefit of the staff around her, though the tight set of her jaw betrayed exactly how close she was to losing that composure entirely. Logan moved quickly to control the narrative, telling anyone who would listen that the disgruntled contractor who had been removed from the property must have tampered with the systems out of spite before he left. Evelyn wanted to believe that version of events, because it was simpler, because it placed the blame somewhere convenient and far away from her own decision to ignore a clear warning. But a quiet, persistent doubt had already begun forming in the back of her mind, the kind that refuses to be reasoned away no matter how loudly Logan insisted otherwise. The internal engineering team worked through the morning and into the afternoon without making any real progress, running the same diagnostics over and over and arriving at the same dead end each time. Each hour that passed without an answer brought new calls from nervous investors, several of whom began hinting that they might reconsider their commitments if Carter Aero could not demonstrate basic operational reliability before the summit even began. One major partner threatened outright to withdraw entirely, citing concerns that a company unable to maintain its own fleet had no business courting international contracts worth billions. Evelyn took each call personally, her voice steady on the surface while her composure frayed further with every conversation, the pressure mounting in a way she had never experienced even during her toughest years running the company. Somewhere beneath the noise of phones ringing and engineers arguing over diagnostic readouts, a single sentence kept circling back through her thoughts uninvited. "Then your 12 jets are finished," Mason had told her, and now, standing in a hangar full of grounded aircraft, she could no longer pretend those words had been an empty threat. By late afternoon, Evelyn had run out of options that did not involve admitting she had made a serious mistake, and she finally gave the order to find Mason Reed and bring him back to the hangar by whatever means necessary. It did not take long. He was exactly where anyone who actually knew him might have expected, working alone in a small rented garage on the edge of town, elbow deep in the engine of an old delivery truck that belonged to one of his neighbors. He did not look surprised when a Carter Aero vehicle pulled up outside, nor did he rush to wipe the grease from his hands before stepping out to see who had come looking for him. Evelyn arrived in person rather than sending Logan, a decision that surprised even her, though she told herself it was simply the fastest way to resolve an inconvenient problem. She kept her tone clipped and businesslike as she explained the situation, framing it as an opportunity for him to prove the warnings he had made were accurate, rather than admitting outright how badly his predictions had already come true. Mason listened without interrupting, wiping his hands slowly on a rag, while he weighed her words against the memory of being escorted out of her hangar like a problem to be removed. He told her plainly that he would not come back simply to be used as a convenient scapegoat if the situation could not be fixed, someone for the board to blame quietly while the real failures stayed buried. Evelyn, for the first time since he had met her, let her voice soften slightly, asking him directly what he had actually seen in those records that made him so certain disaster was coming. It was the first real question she had asked him, rather than a command, and something in the shift did not go unnoticed by either of them standing in that quiet garage. Mason agreed to return, but only under conditions he stated clearly, and without room for negotiation, full and unrestricted access to every maintenance record, every parts inventory, and every technician on the team, with no interference from anyone above him in the chain of command. Evelyn hesitated only briefly before agreeing, recognizing that whatever pride she had left mattered far less than salvaging the company her father had built from nothing. Back at the hangar, Logan grew visibly uneasy when he learned Mason was returning with that level of authority, his easy confidence from earlier in the week replaced by a tension he tried badly to hide behind forced enthusiasm. He offered to help Mason settle back in, an offer that felt less like cooperation and more like a man trying to stay close enough to monitor exactly how much the truth was about to surface. Mason accepted the gesture politely, giving no indication that he had already begun to suspect Logan's fingerprints were somewhere underneath the falsified records he had found 2 days earlier. As the sun set over the runway, Mason walked back into the hangar that had cast him out only 48 hours before, this time with Evelyn walking silently beside him rather than ahead of him. Mason walked back into the hangar under the watchful, skeptical eyes of the same technical team that had treated him like an afterthought only days earlier, though none of them dared voice their doubts out loud this time. He did not waste time defending himself or explaining his presence, moving instead directly to the first jet, and beginning a methodical inspection that followed a clear, deliberate logic rather than the scattered guesswork the internal team had been relying on. Within an hour, he had identified that all 12 jets shared a single fuel coordination module that had been quietly replaced with a substandard component, one that mimicked the appearance of the original part closely enough to pass a casual glance. He explained to the gathered engineers, in plain and patient language, that the failures had nothing to do with the engines themselves and everything to do with a falsified maintenance chain designed to hide exactly this kind of substitution. Evelyn watched from a short distance away, arms crossed, listening to him speak with the quiet authority of someone who had clearly done this kind of work long before he ever set foot in her hangar. He pulled up the digital service history on a tablet and projected it onto a large screen at the front of the workspace, walking the room through the exact sequence of failures step by step, showing how each falsified entry had created the illusion of routine maintenance while the actual systems degraded unnoticed underneath. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence as the pattern became undeniable even to engineers who had spent the entire previous day insisting no such pattern existed. Logan tried to interject, suggesting that Mason was exaggerating the severity of the problem to make himself appear more valuable than he actually was. Mason did not raise his voice or react with irritation, simply requesting calmly that the sealed parts inventory be opened so everyone in the room could see for themselves whether his claims held up against the physical evidence. Evelyn gave the order immediately, cutting off whatever objection Logan was preparing to offer next. When the storage room was finally unlocked and the inventory checked against the official records, the discrepancy was immediate and impossible to explain away. Dozens of boxes that should have contained genuine, certified components were missing entirely, replaced on paper by entries that no one in the room could account for. Evelyn stood in the doorway of that storage room, staring at empty shelves that represented far more than missing parts, representing instead a betrayal that had been unfolding inside her own company for longer than she wanted to consider. The technicians who had mocked Mason days earlier now watched him with a different kind of attention, the kind reserved for someone who had just proven, beyond doubt, that he understood their fleet better than anyone else standing in that hangar. Mason said nothing about the shift in their attitudes, focused entirely on the work still ahead of him, because identifying the problem had only been the first and easiest part of what needed to happen next. Mason spent the following hours tracing the falsified signatures buried inside the maintenance database, isolating a pattern of digital approvals that did not match the actual engineers credited with the work. Several of the signatures belonged to junior technicians who, when quietly questioned, admitted they had flagged irregularities months earlier only to be told by Logan that their reports needed revision before they could be filed officially. Those revisions, it turned out, had stripped out every warning that mattered, leaving behind sanitized paperwork that made a failing system look perfectly healthy on paper. Evelyn listened to each account with a growing cold anger, the kind that comes from realizing the company bearing your family name had been quietly hollowed out from the inside by someone she had trusted without question. Logan, sensing the walls closing in, pivoted quickly, insisting loudly that Mason had every reason to fabricate this entire narrative as revenge for the humiliation he had suffered days earlier in front of the board. Mason responded to the accusation with the same unshaken calm he had shown from the very beginning, laying out a timeline that made Logan's theory impossible to sustain under any honest scrutiny. The falsified entries, he explained, stretched back months, long before he had ever been hired as a contractor, which meant the corruption had been operating quietly long before he ever set foot in the hangar. Evelyn studied the dates herself, cross-referencing them against her own calendar, and found no way to dispute what Mason had laid in front of her with such methodical precision. For the first time since the crisis began, she turned to face the board members gathered in the room and stated plainly that she believed Mason, not Logan, and that the company's energy needed to shift entirely toward fixing what had been broken rather than assigning blame to the man who had uncovered it. The weight of what Mason revealed next settled over the room like a physical pressure, pressing the air thinner with every word. If even one of the 12 jets had taken off in its current condition, he explained, the fuel coordination failure could have triggered a catastrophic engine shutdown at altitude, the kind of failure that leaves no margin for recovery and no second chances for the people on board. The room that had spent days treating his warnings as an inconvenience now understood, fully and finally, exactly how close they had come to a tragedy that would have ended careers, lawsuits, and very likely human lives. Evelyn felt the full weight of her earlier dismissal settle into her chest, a guilt sharper than any business failure she had ever experienced in her career. The mockery that had defined her first impression of Mason Reed had curdled, in the space of a few days, into something closer to reverence, and the fear in the room had finally replaced the contempt that once filled it. Among the senior advisors called in to assess the unfolding crisis was Samuel Grant, a retired aviation consultant with decades of experience and a memory for names that rarely failed him even after years away from active service. The moment he heard Mason Reed's name spoken aloud in the hangar, something in his expression shifted, a flicker of recognition that had nothing to do with the past few days of chaos. He approached Mason quietly, away from the others, and asked if he was the same Mason Reed who had once served inside a highly classified jet propulsion division, a name Samuel had not heard spoken aloud in many years. Mason did not deny it, though he answered with the same reluctant brevity he brought to everything connected to that chapter of his life, clearly uninterested in turning the moment into a story about himself. Samuel pressed gently, telling Evelyn afterward that Mason had once single-handedly identified a failure that would have grounded an entire military squadron, saving lives that no one outside a small circle of officials ever knew had been at risk. He explained further that Mason had left that world abruptly after a commanding officer chose to bury a serious safety violation rather than risk the budget consequences of admitting it publicly, a decision that had cost Mason his faith in the very institutions he had once trusted completely. Mason had walked away quietly, refusing offers from private contractors who wanted to capitalize on his expertise, choosing instead a life defined by anonymity rather than recognition. Evelyn absorbed this information slowly, piecing together why a man with his obvious skill had spent years fixing small engines in a forgotten corner of town instead of commanding rooms full of executives eager for his expertise. It explained, too, why he had never once tried to leverage his background for higher pay or better treatment, choosing instead to let his work speak entirely for itself, regardless of who was listening or who was watching. Standing in the hangar that evening, watching Mason quietly continue his inspection despite everything that had been revealed about him, Evelyn felt something shift inside her that went beyond simple professional respect. She understood now that his calm in the face of her earlier cruelty had not been weakness or resignation, but the steady discipline of a man who had already survived institutions far colder than her boardroom. He had not warned her about the fuel systems to prove a point or protect his pride, but because somewhere underneath the worn jacket and the quiet manner was a man who still believed, despite everything, that protecting people mattered more than being believed. Evelyn watched him work without interrupting, and for the first time since the crisis began, her guilt softened slightly into something closer to genuine respect for the man she had so carelessly dismissed. Sensing that the walls were closing in around him, Logan made a desperate attempt that evening to delete portions of the maintenance database before anyone could connect his access permissions to the falsified entries Mason had already uncovered. He underestimated, however, that Mason had anticipated exactly this kind of move and had quietly mirrored the critical records onto a separate backup system days earlier, a precaution born from years spent working around people who preferred convenient silence over inconvenient truth. When Logan's deletion attempt failed to erase anything that actually mattered, he shifted strategy entirely, appearing before the board to argue loudly that Mason had manipulated Evelyn into trusting him completely, exploiting her panic to seize control of decisions that belonged to trained engineers rather than outside contractors. One of the company's largest investors, already nervous about the unfolding crisis, issued an ultimatum that demanded a full explanation within 24 hours or the immediate withdrawal of every commitment tied to the upcoming summit. Evelyn found herself standing at a crossroads that tested everything she believed about leadership and pride, forced to choose between protecting the polished image she had spent years building or trusting the judgment of a man she had humiliated only days earlier. Mason, for his part, offered no dramatic ultimatum of his own, simply laying out a tight but achievable plan that could restore all 12 jets to safe operating condition within the narrow window the investor had given them. His plan came with one firm condition that he stated without hesitation, insisting that Logan be removed from any position of authority over the technical team immediately, before the man could cause further damage to systems already stretched dangerously thin. Evelyn did not hesitate this time, the way she had hesitated days earlier in that same hangar, and made the decision swiftly, stripping Logan of his authority on the spot in front of the very staff he had spent years intimidating into silence. Logan's composure finally cracked under the weight of his own exposure, and he left the hangar that night not with quiet dignity, but with a bitter parting threat aimed directly at Evelyn, warning her that Carter Aero would collapse entirely without him pulling its strings from behind the scenes. Evelyn watched him go without flinching, the fear she might have felt only a week earlier, replaced now by a hardened resolve she had not known she possessed until the crisis forced it out of her. The remaining staff in the hangar exchanged glances that mixed relief with disbelief, watching the man who had quietly controlled so much of their working lives walk out through the same doors Mason had been forced through only days before. Mason did not celebrate the moment or remark on the irony of it, returning instead to the diagnostic screens still glowing in front of him, fully aware that removing Logan had only cleared the obstacles, not yet solved the actual crisis still sitting heavily across 12 grounded jets. The clock, as everyone in that hangar understood without needing to say it aloud, had already started running again. Mason organized the repair effort with the calm precision of someone who had run far higher stakes operations long before he ever set foot in Evelyn's hangar, dividing the 12 jets into 3 groups based on the severity and complexity of their individual failures. He prioritized the aircraft most likely to be restored quickly, reasoning that early successes would build momentum and confidence among a technical team still rattled by days of confusion and blame. Evelyn surprised everyone, including herself, by staying through the night rather than retreating to her office to manage the crisis from a comfortable distance. She moved between workstations approving parts orders, contacting suppliers directly, and clearing whatever bureaucratic obstacles threatened to slow the engineers down, a kind of hands-on involvement she had never once shown in her years running the company. Mason directed the effort without raising his voice or issuing harsh demands, and yet every technician in that hangar followed his instructions with an attentiveness that command alone could never have produced. Sometime past midnight, one of the younger engineers pulled Mason aside quietly and confessed, with visible shame, that he had noticed irregularities in the fuel systems weeks earlier, but had been pressured by Logan into rewriting his reports to avoid drawing unwanted attention. Mason listened without judgment, telling the young man plainly that the greatest failure in any system was never the mistake itself, but the culture that punished honesty about mistakes until people learned to hide them instead of fixing them. Evelyn overheard the exchange from a few steps away and felt the words settle into her with uncomfortable clarity, recognizing in them an indictment of the very company culture she had built and defended for years without question. She said nothing in that moment, but something in her expression told Mason she had heard every word, and that the lesson had landed exactly where it needed to. By the early hours of the morning, 3 of the 12 jets had been successfully restored and tested, their engines settling into the smooth, steady hum that represented hours of careful, methodical work finally paying off. The relief in the hangar was real but brief, interrupted almost immediately when the flagship jet, the one scheduled to carry the most critical investors, returned diagnostic results far worse than anyone had anticipated. Mason examined the readouts closely, his expression hardening as he recognized signs that pointed toward something more deliberate than ordinary mechanical failure. something closer to an act of sabotage carried out with a clear and specific target in mind. He said nothing immediately to alarm the team further, choosing instead to quietly gather additional evidence before raising his suspicions to Evelyn, aware that panic at this stage could undo hours of hard-won progress. Outside, the sky had begun its slow shift from black toward gray, the hours remaining before the scheduled test flight shrinking faster than anyone in that hangar wanted to acknowledge. The flagship jet sat apart from the others, larger and more heavily customized, the aircraft designated to carry the most important investors directly into the heart of the summit negotiations. Mason discovered after a careful hours-long search that a pressure regulation valve deep inside the fuel system had been manually altered in a way that no routine maintenance error could explain, a deliberate adjustment designed to fail only under specific, predictable flight conditions. It became clear almost immediately that this had been Logan's final move before his removal, a trap left behind specifically to ensure that even a successful recovery effort would end in catastrophic failure when it mattered most. Evelyn's first instinct was to call the authorities immediately and have Logan arrested before he could disappear entirely, but Mason urged her to wait just long enough to neutralize the immediate danger sitting inside that jet. Every minute spent on outside intervention, he reminded her, was a minute closer to a test flight deadline that could not be moved without losing the investors entirely. The repair that followed tested every ounce of skill Mason had built across a career most people in that hangar would never fully understand, requiring him to maneuver into an impossibly tight technical compartment barely large enough for his shoulders. Sweat beaded along his forehead as he worked by the narrow beam of a single flashlight, adjusting components by feel as much as sight, aware that one wrong movement could undo hours of progress or worse, injure him in the cramped, confined space. The countdown to the scheduled test flight ticked steadily closer with every passing minute, the tension in the hangar thick enough that even the most experienced engineers stood in near total silence, watching the access panel where Mason had disappeared. When the engine finally roared to life for its test run, it screamed unevenly at first, a harsh, grinding pitch that made several technicians flinch and step back instinctively from the aircraft. Then gradually the pitch smoothed, the vibration settling into the steady, confident hum that every person in that hangar had been desperate to hear since the crisis began. A collective breath seemed to release through the entire space as the flagship jet completed its test sequence without a single warning light flashing across its console. Evelyn turned to look at Mason as he climbed out from beneath the aircraft, exhaustion etched across his face, grease staining his hands and forearms, and for the first time she saw him not as a desperate contractor or a convenient scapegoat, but as the man who had quietly saved her entire company from a disaster that would have ended careers and very possibly lives. She did not say anything immediately, the moment too large for words that could capture it properly, but something in the way she looked at him made clear that the contempt she once felt had been replaced entirely by something far closer to awe. With every jet finally stabilized and cleared, Mason presented the full body of evidence before the assembled board, laying out the falsified components, the altered signatures, the deleted records, and finally the deliberate sabotage discovered inside the flagship aircraft. The presentation he gave was methodical rather than dramatic, each piece of evidence building naturally on the last until the conclusion became impossible for anyone in the room to dispute or dismiss. Word arrived partway through the meeting that security had intercepted Logan attempting to transfer funds to an account overseas, an act that immediately confirmed every suspicion the gathered evidence had already pointed toward. He was brought back into the building under far less dignified circumstances than the ones in which he had left, his earlier confidence completely gone, replaced by the hollow expression of a man who understood there was no longer any narrative he could spin convincingly. Faced with evidence too overwhelming to deny, Logan confessed in front of the entire board that he had accepted payments from a rival aviation firm in exchange for quietly weakening Carter Aero's operations from the inside, payments that had funded the very sabotage that nearly grounded the company's most important week. Evelyn absorbed the confession in stunned silence, the betrayal cutting deeper than any business setback she had ever experienced, made worse by the fact that she had trusted Logan implicitly for years without ever questioning his loyalty. Mason did not gloat or savor the moment of vindication that anyone else might have indulged in after everything he had endured at the hands of this company. Instead, he reminded Evelyn quietly, away from the noise of the board's reaction, that the aviation industry never forgives arrogance, no matter how powerful or well-connected the person carrying it happens to be. The board, shaken by how close the company had come to disaster, made clear that Evelyn herself bore responsibility for ignoring the original warning that could have prevented the entire crisis from unfolding in the first place. Rather than deflect that responsibility the way she might have done only a week earlier, Evelyn stood before her own employees and acknowledged her mistake openly, offering Mason a sincere and unguarded apology in front of the very people who had once watched her humiliate him without hesitation. It was, in every sense that mattered, the most significant reversal of fortune Mason had experienced in years, transforming him in the span of a single week from a man dismissed as worthless into the person whose judgment the entire company now depended on completely. The hangar that had once echoed with mockery now held something closer to quiet respect, settling over the space like a kind of overdue correction to everything that had gone wrong before it. Mason personally supervised the first full test flight following the repairs, standing on the tarmac with a headset pressed to his ear, listening to every call-out from the pilots as the aircraft moved through its checklist with careful precision. Evelyn waited inside the operations room, unable to sit still, her eyes fixed on the screen, displaying live telemetry from each jet as it rolled toward the runway one after another. One by one, all 12 aircraft completed their safety evaluations without a single flagged warning, the kind of clean, uneventful result that represented countless hours of effort compressed into a handful of tense minutes. The investors who had threatened to withdraw their commitments now watched with visible relief, several of them approaching Evelyn afterwards specifically to praise the technical leadership that had clearly saved the entire summit from collapsing. One senior partner went further, telling her directly that any future agreement with Carter Aero would depend heavily on Mason remaining involved in the company's ongoing operations. Evelyn wasted no time formally offering Mason a permanent position as the company's director of technical safety, a role with significant authority, compensation, and visibility that would have seemed unthinkable to either of them only a week earlier. Mason, true to the quiet character he had shown throughout the entire ordeal, did not accept immediately, expressing concern that taking such a public title too quickly might turn him into a symbol the company could use to paper over deeper problems, rather than genuinely fixing them. He wanted assurance that real, lasting change would follow, not simply a polished announcement designed to reassure investors and then quietly forgotten once the immediate crisis faded from memory. Evelyn understood his hesitation completely, recognizing in it the same integrity that had driven every decision he made throughout the crisis, and she committed herself fully to reshaping the maintenance culture from the ground up, protecting honest engineers and placing safety permanently above short-term profit. She promised him concrete changes rather than vague reassurances, detailing specific reforms to reporting structures that would make it impossible for another Logan to operate unchecked for years. Mason listened to her commitments carefully, weighing them against everything he had witnessed about her character over the preceding days, searching for the gap between promise and follow-through that experience had taught him to expect from people in positions of power. What he found instead, somewhat to his own surprise, was a woman genuinely transformed by the crisis rather than simply managing its aftermath for appearances, someone who seemed to understand for the first time what her position actually demanded of her. He told her he would consider the offer seriously, neither accepting nor refusing outright, leaving the decision open while the company began the slow work of rebuilding trust both internally and with the partners who had nearly walked away. Evelyn accepted his measured response without pushing further, recognizing that trust, once broken as thoroughly as it had been inside her company, could not be rebuilt through a single grand gesture or a title alone. The two of them stood together on the tarmac as the last jet completed its landing sequence, neither speaking, both aware that something significant had shifted permanently between them. Several nights after the crisis had finally settled, Evelyn found Mason alone in the hangar long after everyone else had gone home, running one last check on the systems that had nearly cost the company everything. She approached him quietly, without the sharp authority that had once defined every interaction between them, and offered a personal apology that went beyond anything she had said in front of the board. She told him plainly that the remark about a toy plane had been cruel, unnecessary, and built entirely on assumptions she had never bothered to question before speaking them aloud. Mason listened without interrupting, then told her honestly that he did not need her sympathy or her guilt, only her genuine assurance that she would never again look at the people working under her and assume their worth based on appearances alone. Evelyn admitted, with more vulnerability than she usually allowed herself, that the entire experience had reshaped not just her view of him, but her understanding of the company and the people who kept it running every single day. There was no rushed declaration of feeling between them, no dramatic confession exchanged beneath the hangar lights, only a quiet, steady respect that had grown slowly out of crisis and honesty rather than convenience. Mason mentioned briefly, almost in passing, that everything he did, every job he took, and every risk he weighed carefully, came back to wanting a simple, peaceful life he could be proud of when he looked back on it. Evelyn caught, in that small admission, a glimpse of the gentler man hidden underneath the guarded exterior he showed the rest of the world, someone who measured success in honesty rather than recognition. The two of them stood together for a long moment, looking out at the 12 jets gleaming under the hangar lights, fully restored and finally trustworthy again. Neither one reached for the other, neither one needed to, because what had begun between them already felt steadier than anything built on urgency or impulse. On the day the new contracts were finally signed, all 12 Carter Aerojets lifted cleanly into a bright morning sky while reporters and investors watched from the tarmac, capturing the kind of moment the company had nearly lost the chance to ever experience. Evelyn stood before the cameras and did something almost no executive in her position would have considered doing a week earlier, refusing to take credit for the recovery and stating plainly, in front of every camera present, that Mason Reed alone had saved the company from a catastrophe of its own making. Mason was given full authority to build an independent safety division, one structured deliberately to operate outside the pressures and politics of daily operations, answerable only to standards rather than to any single executive above him. The young engineers who had been silenced and pressured under Logan's old leadership were quietly reinstated to their original positions, their honesty finally treated as the asset it had always been rather than the liability it was once made to seem. Carter Aero emerged from the crisis intact, but the deeper transformation was never really about the jets themselves, settling instead into the culture that had nearly destroyed the company from within. Evelyn changed visibly in the months that followed, trading the rigid, dismissive certainty that had once defined her leadership for a willingness to listen, even to the people she might once have overlooked entirely without a second thought. Mason, for his part, stopped being the man other people mocked or dismissed on sight, becoming instead someone the entire industry quietly came to respect for the precision and integrity he brought to every decision. The story that spread afterward in boardrooms and hangars far beyond Carter Aero often returned to a single moment that captured everything that had changed. She once believed he could not even fix a toy plane, yet he had been the one who saved 12 real jets, along with everyone who would have been aboard them. The ending that settled over both of them carried no grand promises or sweeping declarations, only the quiet, steady understanding that something real had been built between two people who had started as adversaries and ended as equals. Evelyn and Mason walked out of the hangar together that evening, side by side rather than one leading the other, watching the sun drop low over a runway that had nearly witnessed tragedy, and instead became the place where everything changed for both of them. Neither needed words to mark the moment, because the silence between them now held none of the tension it once carried, replaced instead by something closer to trust earned the hardest way possible. If this story leaves you believing the person everyone underestimates might be the one who saves them all, then it has already done exactly what it was meant to do. Stay with this story until the end, because the secret Mason hides will force Evelyn to pay with her pride.